Margaret held the Christmas ornament her granddaughter Lily had painted years ago, a small wooden snowman, faded by time, yet still full of meaning. The snowman wore a poorly painted red hat and a crooked smile that, to her, symbolized the perfect imperfection of family. Christmas had always been her favorite time of the year, the decorations, the feasts, and most of all, having everyone gathered under the same roof. What could embody the Christmas spirit more than the warmth of memories and the love of family? That evening, Margaret was excited. Despite her age and the fatigue that sometimes left her breathless, she had baked cookies for her children and grandchildren. The table was set, an embroidered tablecloth, plates reserved for special occasions, and a wreath she had crafted herself from branches in her garden. While arranging the silverware, she overheard her eldest son Andrew talking with Melissa and Jonathan in the living room. They were whispering, their voices too low for her to catch what they were saying. When they finally joined her in the kitchen, there was something off about their demeanor. Andrew, usually assertive and confident, seemed nervous. Melissa was fiddling with her phone, avoiding eye contact. Jonathan, the youngest, looked uncomfortable, staring at the door as if planning his escape. "Mom, we need to talk," Andrew began, clearing his throat. "It must be important considering how serious you all look," Margaret said with a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. No one laughed. "Look, this is complicated, but we've come to the conclusion that it would be better for you to spend some time in a place where you can get more care, more structure. You know, doctors, nurses," Andrew explained, choosing his words carefully. "What do you mean by more care?" Margaret asked, crossing her arms. A sense of unease began to build in her chest. "We're talking about a home, Mom. It's a great place, really. Comfortable, beautiful, with people your age to keep you company," Melissa finally said, lifting her eyes from her phone. Margaret blinked a few times, unable to believe what she was hearing. "A home? You're talking about a nursing home now at Christmas?" "Mom, you have to understand," Jonathan stammered, stepping in. "We're not abandoning you. It's just that our lives are so hectic right now. It's temporary, just until things settle down." "Temporary? And until then I'm supposed to stay in a strange place away from my home? Away from you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Andrew sighed. "You're not understanding, Mom. This is for your own good." That night, as Margaret was driven to Evergreen's home, her heart felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Her children barely spoke to her during the ride. The dark, cold winter landscape passed by the car windows, but Margaret could hardly see it through the tears welling in her eyes. When they arrived, the lights of the nursing home shone brightly, as if trying to disguise the somber atmosphere. The place looked clean, even welcoming at first glance, but there was something artificial about the sparkle of the decorations and the exaggerated friendliness of the receptionist. "You're going to like it here, Mum," Melissa said, before hurrying off, not waiting for a response. Jonathan didn't even look back. Andrew lingered a moment longer, but only said, "We'll be back soon." Margaret was escorted to room 217, a small, sterile space. The iron bed had stark white sheets, and the only window faced an empty courtyard. The nurse who accompanied her gave a brief tour, mentioning a special Christmas dinner planned for the next day to lift the residents' spirits. When the door closed, leaving her alone, Margaret finally let her tears fall. How could her own family leave her here, and on Christmas Eve no less? As she stared at the small snowman ornament she had brought in her suitcase, a knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Agnes, a woman who looked about 80. Her grey hair was pinned in a bun, and her tired eyes held a peculiar sparkle. "First night here?" Agnes asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Don't worry, dear. Most of us were left like this too, especially at Christmas." Margaret tried to hold back her tears. "It's so cold here. I never expected to spend Christmas alone." Agnes gave a bittersweet smile. "Alone? You're not alone. Here, we're all in the same boat, each of us with our own story, but they all end in the same place. Come now, don't be like that. There's a mystery here that might make things more interesting." Margaret frowned. "Mystery?" Agnes pointed to the wall beside Margaret's bed. There was a phrase written there, almost imperceptible. "The truth of Christmas is hidden where you least expect it." Before Margaret could ask more, Agnes said her goodbyes. "Tomorrow will be an interesting day. Wait and see." As the night went on, Margaret could hardly sleep. The words on the wall echoed in her mind. Who had written them, and what did they mean? She glanced at the little snowman on her bedside table and whispered to herself, "I'll figure out what this all means." Margaret woke to the sound of laughter in the hallway. At first she thought it was the start of a cheerful morning, but she quickly realized it wasn't quite that. Two staff members were chatting loudly while changing the sheets in a nearby room. Their laughter clashed painfully with the cold silence of room 217. Margaret looked out the window. The courtyard was covered in a thin layer of snow. The bare trees seemed to bend under the weight of the icy wind. Nothing about the scene reminded her of the Christmas she knew. She used to wake up to the smell of turkey in the oven, hear Lily singing carols, and watch Andrew and Jonathan argue over who was better at decorating the Christmas tree. All of that now felt so far away, as if it belonged to another life. At the communal breakfast, Margaret sat at a table in the back, away from the others' conversations. Many seemed resigned, laughing without joy or chatting about trivial matters. Only Agnes, seated beside a thin, serious-looking man, seemed to carry a different energy. "You should join us," Agnes said, waving at Margaret. "There's no point in being alone here." Margaret hesitated, but eventually walked over. Agnes introduced the man beside her as Harold, a former literature professor who had a habit of reciting poetry. He barely smiled at Margaret, but seemed to study her closely. "So, you're new here," Harold finally said, breaking the silence. "This place can be worse than it seems, but it can also be better. It depends on what you're looking for." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "And what is there to look for here? It seems like everyone is just waiting." Harold smirked. "Some wait. Others find reasons to keep going. And sometimes there are surprises." Agnes chimed in. "Surprises like the messages on the walls, right? You saw the one in room 217, didn't you, Margaret? I bet you're curious." Margaret nodded. "I saw it, but I don't know what to make of it. Who wrote them and why?" Agnes shrugged, as if it were a mystery even she couldn't fully unravel. "They say it was a former resident, but no one knows for sure. What we do know is that these messages tend to show up around Christmas." As the day went on, Margaret noticed how many of the residents seemed apathetic. Some just stared out the windows, while others were lost in their own memories. She felt a mix of sadness and anger. Was this what her children thought she deserved? To be left in a place where time seemed to stand still? That afternoon, Margaret decided to explore the nursing home. As she walked through the hallways, she found another note hidden behind a curtain in the main hall. The message read, "Forgiveness is the hardest gift to give, but the most powerful one." Those words stirred something deep inside her. What did they mean? And who was leaving these messages? She held the phrase in her mind, sensing there was more going on than met the eye. That evening, Margaret returned to the attic, where she had noticed boxes of Christmas decorations the day before. She found Agnes there holding an old silver Christmas ornament. "My daughter made this when she was 8 years old," Agnes said, looking at the ornament with sadness in her eyes. "Now she has a family of her own. I don't even know if she remembers I exist." Margaret felt a lump in her throat. "Why don't you try reaching out to her?" Agnes let out a bitter laugh. "I've tried. She's busy like everyone else. This place, Margaret, is where they put us when they're tired of trying." Margaret didn't respond. She just looked at the ornament in Agnes's hand and wondered, do my children feel the same way about me? But before leaving the attic, Margaret found an old letter inside a box of decorations. It was dated 1992 and seemed to have been written by a former resident. The letter read, "If you're reading this, it means there's still time to change things. Christmas is proof that miracles happen. You just have to believe and act." Margaret held the letter in her hands for a long time. It felt like a direct message to her. But what could she do to change her situation? The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling a different energy. The letter she had found in the attic wouldn't leave her mind. There's still time to change things. But how? She was in a nursing home, far from her house, her family, and seemingly any chance of reconciliation. Yet, something about the tone of the letter made her feel alive, as though this Christmas could be different. At breakfast, Margaret started paying more attention to what was happening around her. She noticed how many residents stared blankly into space, without any expectation of something better. She saw how the staff, though polite, moved mechanically, as if they were just going through the motions. But most of all, Margaret felt that there was something wrong about the atmosphere, a quiet discomfort that hung in the air. "You're thinking about the letter, aren't you?" Agnes said, approaching her table. "I saw how you were holding it last night." Margaret hesitated, but eventually admitted, It's like a plea for help, as if someone wanted us to do something, but I don't know what." Agnes smiled. "Funny, isn't it? We come here thinking life is already over, but every now and then, something shows up to remind us that we can still make a difference." Margaret looked at Agnes curiously. "Do you really believe that? That we can still change things?" "I believe that if we don't try, we'll never know," Agnes replied. "And maybe Christmas is the perfect time to do it." Later that day, Margaret decided to visit Harold, the former literature professor, who seemed to know more than he let on about the messages. She found him in his chair, reading an old book of poetry. When she mentioned the letter and the mysterious phrases, Harold chuckled softly. "These messages, they always show up as Christmas approaches. It's as if the place has a spirit of its own, trying to remind us of something we've forgotten," he said. "But who writes them? Who left that letter in the attic?" Margaret pressed. Harold paused before answering. "No one knows for sure. Some say it was a man named Walter who lived here years ago. He was known for trying to bring hope to everyone, even after his own family abandoned him. But others believe it's something bigger than just one person, like the spirit of Christmas itself." Margaret wasn't sure if she believed that explanation, but she couldn't deny that there was something special about the messages. She decided she had to do something, not just for herself, but for the other residents, who seemed to have given up hope entirely. Meanwhile, Margaret began to notice that many of the residents' belongings were disappearing. Watches, rings, photos, small things that held great sentimental value. When she mentioned this to Agnes, the reply came with a bitter edge. "This happens all the time here. Some of the staff sell the stuff for extra cash, and of course no one does anything. Who's going to listen to a bunch of old folks?" Margaret was outraged. How could something like this happen in a place that was supposed to care for and respect its residents? She knew she couldn't ignore it. Even if her children weren't by her side, she still had a voice, and she intended to use it. That night, Margaret returned to the attic, this time determined to find more clues about the mystery of the messages. There, she found another phrase written on the bottom of a box of decorations. "The greatest gift you can give is your courage." Those words struck a chord deep within her. Margaret realized that if she wanted to change things, she would have to face her fears. She decided to organize a Christmas celebration for the residents, not just to bring joy to the home, but also to draw attention to what was happening there and expose the wrongdoing. Margaret began talking to other residents, trying to convince them to participate. Many were hesitant at first, but her energy was contagious. Agnes was the first to support the idea, and Harold volunteered to recite a special poem during the event. Slowly, others started to get involved, bringing decorations, sharing ideas, and even recounting Christmas memories from their pasts. Of course, things wouldn't be that simple. The nursing home staff began noticing the activity and didn't like what they saw. One staff member, a woman named Denise, confronted Margaret directly. "What do you think you're doing? We don't have the resources for this kind of thing. And frankly, you should all be grateful we even have time to take care of you," Denise said coldly. Margaret met Denise's gaze with determination. "We're just trying to bring some joy to this place. Shouldn't that be something you'd want too?" Denise huffed and walked away, but Margaret knew the confrontation wasn't over. Still, she was determined to press on. As she prepared the final details for the celebration, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. It was Lily, the young volunteer who had shown up a few days earlier. Although Margaret initially thought she was her granddaughter, she quickly realized it was just a coincidence in the name. "I heard about what you're trying to do," Lily said, "and I want to help. I've also heard some things about this place, things that shouldn't be happening." Margaret told Lily about the missing belongings and the mysterious messages. Lily promised to investigate and see what she could uncover. The next day, as everyone prepared for the party, Lily returned with shocking news. She had discovered that Denise and another staff member were stealing the residents' belongings and selling them online. Margaret knew this had to be exposed, but what happened next would change everything. On Christmas Eve, Evergreen's home looked completely different. The once gloomy and almost empty main hall now sparkled with lights from the decorations they had found in the attic. Handmade wreaths adorned the walls, and a makeshift Christmas tree assembled by Harold and Agnes stood proudly in the center of the room. For the first time in years, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The residents gathered, dressed in their best outfits. Harold recited poems in his deep, resonant voice, while others shared stories of Christmases past. For the first time since her arrival, Margaret saw genuine smiles on the faces around her. But at the back of her mind, she knew the night still held challenges. Lily had promised to bring evidence against Denise and the other staff member, but Margaret also had another worry: her children. Andrew, Melissa, and Jonathan still hadn't reached out, and she wondered if they even remembered her on this special night. In the middle of the party, Denise appeared. Her face was stiff, and she seemed uneasy with the celebration. She approached Margaret and, in a low tone, said, "I told you this was a bad idea. You don't have permission to organize events like this without consulting the administration." Margaret lifted her chin, feeling the courage inspired by the messages she had found around the home. "You're worried because you know this party will bring attention to what's happening here, and when people start asking questions, your secrets won't stay hidden for long." Denise narrowed her eyes, but before she could respond, Lily walked into the room holding a tablet. "Sorry to interrupt," Lily said firmly, "but I thought you might want to see this, Denise." Lily connected the tablet to a small TV in the hall, displaying a series of screenshots and messages that proved Denise and another staff member had been selling residents' belongings. The evidence was undeniable. The room went silent. Some residents began murmuring, outraged. Denise tried to defend herself, but her voice was drowned out by protests. Lily promised to forward the evidence to the nursing home administration and the authorities, ensuring that Denise would face the consequences of her actions. Margaret felt a wave of relief, but also pride. Finally, something was changing in this place, and she had played an important role in making it happen. As the party continued, Margaret was surprised by another unexpected event. Jonathan appeared in the hall, holding a clumsily wrapped package. He looked nervous, as if he didn't know where to begin. "Mum," he started, his voice trembling. I don't know what to say. I just know we did something terrible to you, and I'm so sorry." Margaret stood still for a few seconds. Jonathan seemed genuinely remorseful, but where were Andrew and Melissa? Before she could ask, Jonathan explained, "I'm here on behalf of all three of us. Andrew and Melissa are ashamed, but they sent a message too." He handed Margaret an envelope. Inside was a letter signed by all three. The words were humble and filled with regret. They admitted they had acted out of convenience, prioritizing their own lives over their mother's well-being. At the end of the letter, they promised never to leave her alone again. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, but this time they weren't from sadness. "I forgive you," she said, hugging Jonathan. "But I want you to know I'll never forget what happened, and I hope this serves as a lesson for you to become better people." The evening continued with more joy than Margaret could have imagined. Harold recited his final poem, a piece he had written especially for the occasion. "Christmas is a mirror. It shows what we hide, but also what we can become if we have the courage to try." As the residents applauded, Margaret felt a warmth in her heart. It wasn't the Christmas she had envisioned, but in a way it was exactly the one she needed. She had found strength within herself and discovered that even in a place where many felt forgotten, there was room for hope and change. On Christmas morning, Margaret walked through the snow-covered courtyard. The sun shone timidly, and the bare trees looked less melancholy than before. Along the path she found another message, this time written in the snow. "The spirit of Christmas is what we do for each other." Margaret smiled. She didn't know who was behind the messages, but she felt in her heart that she had fulfilled their purpose. When she looked toward the nursing home's entrance, she saw Jonathan stepping out of a car with Andrew and Melissa. They carried bags filled with food and presents. Seeing them, Margaret realized that despite everything, there was still hope for her family, and that Christmas she decided that forgiveness would be the gift she gave herself.